Mr Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, members of the panel. First of all, I want to say what a great privilege it is to be back at MacGill. And it's another occasion for paying tribute to Joe for his foresight in setting up the school, for his persistence in keeping it going, and for the great organisational skills that he brings to bear on this particular week. I can't adequately express my admiration for him. It knows no bounds. But I occasionally express it in a convivial hostelry over a glass of a bottle of wine, which we share together, and look forward to doing so very soon again. And if you will allow me, I want to just acknowledge the presence and pay tribute to a man who's sitting beside Joe, who this morning told me he is 89 years of age, who was my primary school teacher in James Street CBS, known popularly in Dublin as Jambo. So, you did a good job. I can tell you, you did a great job. It was a great school. My father and his two brothers went there. My mother's three brothers went there. My brother went there. Obviously, I went there. So this is in the DNA, it's in the genes, and we got a great education from people like Joseph. I'm very grateful. Taught us a lot about Europe. I'm going to start with two points. One is a story, if I may. And the second is I want to share with you a problem I've been thinking about for about 40 years. Hadn't come to a solution, and belatedly it has hit me, I think, over the last 2 weeks. It's a question of vocabulary. Well, let me start with a story. For whatever reason, my father, who left school at the age of 14, was besotted by the Four Masters. And of course, this is very much Donegal, just down the road here. Very taken by Brother Michael O'Cleary and his work. And despite the fact of going to Brussels for the last 60 years practically, I had never once gone down the road down to Louvain, down to Louvain, to the Irish College in the great university there, until last week. And I got a wonderful lecture from Malachy Valley, who essentially has been the director of the Irish College, the institute situated within the college, for the last 30 years. And what I did not understand was the Four Masters really was only part of a much larger project which the Franciscans had set out around 400 years ago. And this grand project, which is called the Grand Project, consisted of 4 parts, of which the Four Masters were only one. That was the Four Masters was regaining the history of Ireland, putting it down so that it would survive the terrible crisis that Ireland was being subjected to at the time. Of course, simultaneously, Shatrun Keating was writing for his Fasa Eréireann in County Tipperary, also capturing the history of the country and writing it in the first example of modern Irish. But they also wrote captured the lives of the saints. This was to establish the lineage, the history, the honoured place that the Irish Church occupied in the Church at large. They looked at the theology and the philosophy in which we had been engaged going back to 800 or so, which is a very substantial record and a very proud one. And of course, they, in a certain sense, invented St. Patrick. I think the success can be seen in the popularity of St. Patrick's Day all over the world. It starts there. Now, there's a modern version of the Grand Project. The modern version starts, in my view, with Sean Lemass and Ken Whittaker, very much supported and brought to its conclusion, I think, by Gareth Fitzgerald. Lemass saw the way the world was going, and he was haunted, as you can see in his speeches in the Dáil, haunted by the threat of isolation, that this country would be left outside the door. And in fact, he bet down the doors to try and get us into the European Economic Community. Whittaker foresaw very early on that the world was about to become interdependent and policies of protectionism were simply on their way out, which Lamas, of course, had introduced. And the other, of course, was Gareth Fitzgerald. To understand a small country in a very large world had to be very smart and think very clearly strategically. Now, that grand project is what I have always been interested in, and it's going to very much colour my remarks now. I'm trying to put it in this very big context with a lot of history, for which I hope you will forgive me. The other thing is this vocabulary. I've always been very haunted by what is it that we're creating, what words do we use to describe it. And, you know, when you read Monet, he says, wait a minute, we're not constructing a federation, we're not constructing a confederation, we're constructing something completely new for which there's no analogue, there's no precedent. And he actually never describes it in his memoirs, what it is we're doing. Spinelli, where Francis Jacobs is an expert on Spinelli, and I hope someday that Francis will translate Spinelli's great biography from Italian into English. Spinelli makes the point that what's happening in this new Europe is that Europe is being united, but it's being united by the voluntary consent, active participation of the European peoples, and not by force of arms as it had been previously, back to Napoleon and the Romans and wherever. In a recent editorial in the Financial Times, they use 5 synonyms to describe what we call Europe. None of them adequately express what it is and what it is we're working with. The word Europe appeared, obviously. Brussels appears most of the time and is used frequently, if not almost exclusively, by journalists to describe a very complex concept. EU, sometimes it's spelled out in longhand European Union, and occasionally the word Commission is taken as synonymous for wherever it is. These 5 synonyms, don't really capture what it is. It is. And my conclusion at this point of thinking about it in the Institute with my colleagues is the word that we could best use to describe what we actually do together is alliance, or less emotive or carrying less connotations is the word partnership. So I am going to be proceeding for the next few minutes from the concept of this rather large historical context, and with the idea in the back of my head, which I'm sharing with you, that what we're engaged in is an alliance. Now, an alliance is a voluntary partnership, and it carries both rights and responsibilities. And it is not on its way to being a superstate. And one thing about MacGill is that Joe writes very good backgrounds to each session such as this. I hope someday that a student will gather them all over the past 25 years or more and write a thesis about them, because an extraordinary commentary on life as it has been unfolding. So I always read it very carefully, what he writes, and I've read very carefully the background brief for this session, which I've taken as my instructions. So he says, crisis, he says, is not a new phenomenon in Europe, but Brexit perhaps is the most serious challenge to date. Not only that, but there are other challenges which Pádraig Murphy outlined at the beginning: rejection of European integration by large numbers of European peoples, mass migration, stagnant economies leading to high unemployment, and what Joe calls extreme right politics. And then he adds, it's ironic that all this is happening at the moment when probably we need more Europe rather than less. So, what I'm going to do is have a look at the word crisis and the concept of crisis, give my reaction as to whether Brexit is or is not an existential threat, have some words to say about populism, which might be more accurately described as anti-authority politics, look at the forthcoming EU agenda, Ireland's response to it, and then have a brief look at the timetable ahead of us for the next 12 to 24 months. About crisis, about 40 years ago, as I headed out the door one night, unexpectedly, leaving a disgruntled wife and disconsolate children behind, I excused myself on the grounds that it was a crisis, to which came the unanswerable retort from my wife, "There's always a crisis." You know, it took me up short. I've never forgotten it clearly, and I accept the reality is there's always a crisis. And it can be crises within crisis. Jean Monnet had a wonderful approach towards crisis, which he defined as a moment when you can change things, because he said it's only under threat of bad, serious negatives that politicians will act to do things they always knew they should have done. So he looked for a welcome crisis. And I looked at the Tindemans report, Leo Tindemans, former sort of wise man of Europe, Belgian Prime Minister and all that, published in 1975, which my arithmetic is right, is 41 years ago, in which he says, the European ideal, it's gone. It's disappeared. The statesmen, where are they? They're gone. What are we faced with? Crisis for which there are no solutions. That we're distancing Europe from the people. There is this big, huge... if I had read it out here today and said, put a date on that, you'd have said that was written last week. So there's nothing new, I think, in the concept of crisis and people bewailing the state of things as they are. So, okay, so there's nothing new about crisis, but is this one different in terms of its character? That is to say, precipitated by British withdrawal. Well, let me do something counterfactual. Let me start again with a piece of history. This alliance, and here I'm using the word, this alliance was created without Britain. And let's remember they were invited to join at the very beginning. They were given the Schuman Declaration before it was made public. It was considered by the Foreign Secretary over dinner in a restaurant, handed to him by a civil servant, and he handed it back and said, "The Durham miners won't stand for this. The answer is no." 3 years later, they were invited to Messina in Sicily, where the Intergovernmental Conference was held to lay the foundations of the Treaty of Rome. They were invited to that. They sent a middle-ranking bureaucrat, Russell Bretherton, who was given clear instructions that if this thing got serious, you're to stand up and walk out and say goodbye, which he did. For 21 years, it went on without them, the creation of this alliance, the expansion of its range of activities, and the deepening of the way in which the member states of the alliance worked with each other. But then at a certain point, there was a stampede to get in by the United Kingdom. And Francis has rightly referred to the fact that General de Gaulle, not once but twice, rejected UK membership, and of course, along with that, our membership as well. So, if this thing was set up and worked very successfully without them, you know, what is the story when they joined? Well, the astonishing thing is that no sooner were they in the door than they tried to get out of the room. Because in 1974, as you recall, some of you will recall, that Harold Wilson held the first referendum on British membership, which fortunately was won. And then, having decided they would stay inside the room, they changed bosses, and Mrs. Thatcher then tried to rearrange the furniture with her onslaught on the budget and give me back my money, or our money, as she properly put it. And of course, then even John Major was a major threw sand into the works at the Maastricht Intergovernmental Conference. And what we got is not what had originally been intended. Now, Francis, in his commentary on legacy, I think all of which is accurate, made the same point, but I'm going to make it, but make it a different way. This concept of being an awkward partner or an awkward ally has been widely commented upon. Probably the best treatment of that is Stephen George's book under that very title, The Awkward Partner. Hugo Young's wonderful, the journalist from The Observer, wonderful exploration of the long, troubled history of Britain and Europe in his book, This Blessed Plot, both of which were very well worthwhile looking at. This has been an uncomfortable relationship from the very beginning. It has never been settled. just over a year ago, in the Institute, we published the third of our books on Britain and Europe. When we started, it was with Gareth Fitzgerald, who was chairing the project, and chaired the first two books, the production of them. The most recent book has a very simple title that says everything, I think, the point I'm trying to make, which is Britain and Europe, semicolon, or colon, the end game. Well, as you know, the end game in chess is that point where the issue is going to be resolved one way or the other. And that was our feeling, that this had gone to the point where it was either out completely or stay in, however reluctantly, but stay in as a relatively positive partner. Well, we know what the outcome was. And the question that Joe has given us is, can the alliance survive the defection of one of its members, however significant, in terms of economics and politics? My answer to that is yes, providing, of course, that the alliance stays relevant. That is to say, it stays relevant to the issues that the peoples of the countries constituting the alliance are facing. From the beginning, as we know, the emphasis has always been on economics. The economics drives the politics, on growth, employment, and on incomes. What we have to accept, well, it's in front of us, that at the moment, all Western democracies, not just European, all Western democracies are confronted by what's called secular stagnation. That is to say, a state of equilibrium in which the economy does not grow at all. The economists in the room, I know that there are many, will of course recall that the concept originated from Alvin Hansen when he was president of the American Economic Association in his speech before the annual meeting of the association in 1938. And it fell into disuse because of the fact that the economies clearly did not stagnate during the Second World War and subsequently. But they are now, and the idea has been revised by Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, and most particularly at a recent conference about 3 years ago of the IMF. Simply to say, World Bank it was, simply to say that this issue is endemic in all advanced economies, including ones in the East, like Japan, including the great United States itself, and most especially in Europe. And of course, its existence, secular stagnation, is partly part of the causation for the rise of populism, but it is not the only one. But it is very much the foundation upon which what we call populism exists. The other, which it has not been polite to talk about until very recently, is immigration. Herman van Rompuy, who was mentioned here earlier, commissioned a book when he was president of the European Council, so what is going to happen next. And in the introduction to that book, which I was reading again only last night, he says, look, the root cause of all of this is migration. Let's be clear what the problem is and how we're going to react to it. And it is most evident, of course, in France. And with Joe, we've been in the Institute, we've been looking at this, and we've been very conscious of, for example, a book by Andrew Hussey, which is called The French Intifada, which is very well worthwhile reading. Hussey's, who's English, Hussey's argument, but lives in Paris, his argument is that this is an intractable problem. There is no solution for this, which is rather discomforting. But this problem has affected countries that previously were so liberal and advanced, like Scandinavia. My best friend in Sweden wound up being the Minister for Immigration. He's now living in exile in Spain. He said, I was the most unpopular man in the country, and I often felt myself in danger. I don't live there anymore. It's true of the UK, which, as many have explained from the platform, and let's not go into that. How true is it of Ireland? I think it is certainly true, especially if you live out in West County Dublin. So if you get a combination of income stagnation, which has happened, if you get growing inequality, which Piketty in his great work, Capital, amply demonstrates, if you get high unemployment, particularly amongst the young, And if on top of that you add in immigration, which is very visible in terms of dress and colour and whatever, then you have a lethal cocktail. And in my view, you don't solve it by attributing it only to this thing that you call Europe, or saying it's only confined to here. Mr. Trump's elevation as the presidential candidate is a demonstration that no country really is immune to this. Hobbes and Rousseau were mentioned from the platform earlier, which delighted me, to say the least, in the reference to the social contract. Well, I always go back to Cicero for the social contract, which is where I think a lot of the idea originated from, where he said, "Salus populi suprema lex esto." The safety of the people, or the welfare of the people, must be the supreme law, or must be the supreme occupation or preoccupation of those who rule. Now, clearly, that social contract has broken down. And we're going to have to, Colm had some very interesting ideas and observations on this, about realignment of political parties. I speak as the former Secretary-General of the Labour Party here, and as a member of its parliamentary party, which I was. And I said recently in the Institute, those divisions, those political cleavages are finished. They're 19th century. They're over. And we have to realign. And now it's between Democrats and those who aren't. So it doesn't matter whether you're a social Democrat or a Christian Democrat, you're a Democrat first. And there's got to be a merger of those who believe in democratic and liberal values, including the Liberals, including the Greens. On one side, those who don't accept for example, one principle of democratic life, which is, of course, tolerance, especially in your use of language. And there was a very good point made here by Mairead about the influence of language on social media now on political discourse. So I think that is very important to consider, however difficult that is, to consider it as a requirement and as a necessity. It's going to happen in France anyway, as a reaction against Le Pen. The democratic forces, as they did before with Chirac, will come together. It clearly is going to happen in other member states, including, in my view, Germany, where I think the future of the Social Democratic Party is quite clear now. It's going to be merged, in my view, ultimately with the Christian Democratic Party. We see what's happening in Austria. Once a proud standard bearer of a democratic Europe, a man like Bruno Kreisky, who was himself a Jew, the first Austrian chancellor to win an overall majority. And look at his party now in Austria, the strength of it. So that big realignment is going to come, I think. And it's going to have to tackle the questions that go back to the Schuman Declaration, is to tackle the issues that affect the people and come up with concrete solutions based on mutual cooperation, as employment, equality, and above all, security. When you look at the Schuman Declaration, he has it all laid out, 1950, May 9, concrete achievements, which he says will lead to de facto solidarity, and the de facto solidarity will lead to a fusion of interests. A very simple methodology, but very clear. So the question about that is, does Ireland wish to be part of this fusion or not? Now, that's one of the issues that the Brexit result throws up. I think it makes a point that, and which Gareth Fitzgerald was very hot on, was at some point there would be a binary choice between, call it the Alliance, Europe, and the United Kingdom on the other hand. And he said that the choice should be made without hesitation and in an instant. Europe. That means losses, of course, but we have to accept that. And if we are going to make that choice, we're going to be looking or calling upon that other characteristic of the alliance, which is solidarity. We're going to be calling for solidarity to help us overcome this exogenous shock, this asymmetric shock that economists would call, this disproportionate impact that politicians might describe. If we're going to call upon our colleagues in the alliance for help, on the basis of solidarity, then we better be a fully paid-up member of the alliance. And solidarity is a two-way street, and we better show solidarity the other way back. So, looking down at what Joe has asked us to look at, is there going to be a Brexit? Is it going to happen? Without question. Is there going to be a European breakup? No, without question, in my view. Is the United Kingdom going to break up? Undoubtedly, with the departure of Scotland. Is there going to be some sort of security union to deal with external and internal threats, particularly terrorism? Yes. So there are the choices that we've got to make. Do we want to be fully paid up member of all that, including other things like fiscal union and so on? I'll finish by saying that I'm very taken by the government, I was call it advertisement, but presentation of the 1916 celebrations. There are leaflets down the back there that have the set of numbers, 19 and 20 underneath, 19, and then beside 16. The Rising and Brexit, in my view, taking this long historic perspective on it, bookend a century. And it is the beginning, not the end, it is the beginning of history for us. I think it presents us now with the opportunity to create the sort of Ireland that we would have done so anyway had we been independent from the very beginning. It's going to call for a great deal of courage because we no longer, to use the expression that was Pádraig referred to, Ilir Bellach, there's no nurse anymore for us to hang on to. We can't hide in the shadow anymore. We're going to have to look after ourselves now and be careful and be intelligent in presenting our own interests. What are the interests? I think the interests can be reduced to two. One is access to the UK market, and the other is free movement on this island. At the moment, they appear to be competing incompatibilities, because faced with the choice, the British government has only got two things to decide. Which is the priority? Is it the market or is it migration? And the Brexiteer position is it's migration, in which case you automatically rule yourself out of the market, in which case you automatically create a hard frontier, in which case there will be a hard frontier back on the Donegal border with Derry again. So we're going to have to say, wait a second, we can't have that. And we're going to have to, I think, be very creative in our response to this. I think we have to distinguish the free movement of peoples on the one hand and goods and services on the other. I think it's inevitable there will be customs barriers. I think we have to accept that. But there need not be a hard border if we are intelligent about shifting that border. And I think that if I was in Column's position, one point I would really be working on now as an overriding political priority is the shifting of the border into the middle of the Irish Sea. That was done before, during the war. It lasted for many years afterwards. And it separates people from goods and services. What we want is free movement of people, because that has a huge psychological impact on the northern communities, in particular the nationalist communities. Now, the other thing is, in dealing with Northern Ireland, and Column's remarks, I'm sure, are going to get great coverage tomorrow. They were very profound. They were extremely well thought out, most reasonably presented and worded. He quoted John Hume, and so did Pádraig Murphy. I refer back to one idea that John Hume had at the end of the 1970s, which, when he presented it at the time, I have to confess, I opposed. And my party opposed it, and maybe rightly at the time, but let's not excuse ourselves, wrongly anyway, as it has turned out. And that was the concept of condominium. When I heard it first, it took a lot of researching to work out exactly what it was it meant. And of course, it's a territory owned by two states jointly together and run by them together. Now, The reason why I'm saying that is that the north of Ireland now is de facto a condominium. Not de jure, but de facto it is. And I think the challenge now, the task now for Irish governments is to turn something that is de facto into de jure. And it might just contain the seeds of the solution, because it would satisfy, obviously, the community that Colin represents, but also simultaneously the community that the DUP represents. And that was the genius of John Hume's idea in the first place. Just that we weren't smart enough to see the full significance of it. I think it's time to take it down, take it out of the cupboard and brush it off and run with it. At the very least, I think it's going to cause the Brits to think. Now, finish by saying there's been a lot of talk and a wonderful explanation of what's going to happen next. We know what we know. We know what we don't know about the future. We know Article 50 is going to drive everything. We don't know when Article 50 is going to be triggered, which only the Brits can do. We do know that when it's triggered, you've only got 2 years to work out a withdrawal agreement. We do know that the withdrawal agreement is negotiated by the European Council, which consists of presidents and prime ministers. We don't know whether the withdrawal agreement will be running in parallel or sequential to or prior to the other agreement that has got to be worked out, which is the future relationship between Britain and Europe. The probability is, as one diplomat said to me last week in Brussels, that these negotiations will be intertwined and will be arrived at or signed off on at the same time. What it does do, of course, is put the Taoiseach right in the heart of things, because it will be in the European Council ultimately where everything will be sorted out. I have had a long-held opinion that this man is so wonderfully equipped for this task. He's the third longest-serving Prime Minister in the EU at the moment, to use EU, within the alliance. He's extraordinary personal alliances across the board, and most particularly with Angela Merkel. I do not know of anybody better equipped to handle the task ahead. And I wish that were shared by political neophytes in the Fine Gael backbenches. I wish him well. This, end on a note of optimism, this is not the end of history, this is the beginning of history for this country. This is what the four masters down the road, working at night in the cold with candles, dreamed of. This is what Lemass prayed for. This is what Gareth Sherald worked for. Let's do the job.